Hello, and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments, and business trends shaping the global economy. Today, our episode is focusing on recent updates and changes in FDA's policies regarding the development of drugs and biologics. There's been quite a bit of activity from the agency as of late, and so plenty of topics to choose from. But today, we picked out 3 topics we thought were of particular interest: the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher Program, FDA's changes to recent biosimilar and interchangeable guidances, as well as the newly announced Plausible mechanism pathway. So by way of introduction, my name's Chad Jennings. I'm a counsel in Latham's DC office in the FDA practice group, and I'm joined today by my colleagues, Monica Groat, also a counsel in the FDA practice group, and Nate Beaton, a partner in the FDA practice group. Monica, Nate, thanks so much for being here.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Chad.
Thanks, Chad, and happy to be here. The National Priority Voucher Program is a program to speed FDA's review of applications for drug and biologics, and it really is a shift from the typical 10 to 12-month review period to a 1 or 2-month review period, so a pretty significant shift in time. There are at least 2 ways that FDA has signaled that this review period might be sped up. One of them is by requiring the submission of manufacturing information, often referred to as CMC information, in advance of submission of the entire application, so FDA can essentially pre-review that part of the application. The other application is a so-called tumor board style review meeting.
What's a tumor board style review?
It's an interesting concept, and I'm not aware of FDA taking this approach before. Commissioner McCary has said that the tumor board style meeting will work, that a bunch of reviewers who would typically be considering the application in a more sort of siloed, segmented format will actually meet together in person in the same room and reach a decision on an application after a day-long discussion. So essentially a more sort of interactive consideration of the application.
It's almost like an advisory board in that sense, because you think about a classic tumor board where oncologists, other people go through and they look through a case study, spend that day and go through. So do you think FDA is planning on plugging in its existing mechanisms for AdComs, or do we just not know?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the advisory committee structure is a little different, and that typically involves individuals from outside the agency weighing on a particular application. And based on what we've heard so far about this priority voucher program, it looks like this will be an internal agency process.
That's interesting. I think it's a good distinction. So who's getting these vouchers so far?
Yeah, great question. On October 16th, about a couple months ago as the date of this recording, FDA announced 9 voucher recipients, and on November 6th, there were 6 additional recipients announced. And FDA has said there are more announcements to come, but no specific deadlines that we're waiting for. There are 2 ways that an applicant can seek a voucher. First, there is a mechanism to apply to be part of the voucher program, and FDA has also made clear that some voucher recipients are internally nominated within the agency. So a reviewer or someone else who is familiar with a particular application might suggest a particular drug be considered for a voucher.
And for these applications, has FDA set forth what a typical application looks like? Is that something that we're still waiting for more guidance from the agency?
Yeah, I think so far the agency has said it's a relatively short, I want to say 300-word submission. So not much guidance, but it seems like it's something for applicants that they should really consider taking advantage of if they have the resources and think they might meet the criteria for the program.
Which are?
Thanks, Chad. The criteria have been changed over time. FDA has made different announcements, but I thought Commissioner McCary's recent announcement where he kind of laid out the criteria that FDA is currently considering was interesting and kind of showed the agency's priorities. First of all, one goal of the program is to make drugs affordable, so bring drug prices down. During the announcement, McCary specifically said he was interested in awarding vouchers that would equalize prices with drug prices in other developed wealthy nations. He also emphasized that drugs that meet an important public health need will be considered for the vouchers, as well as drugs and biologics that will be manufactured domestically. So part of the administration's focus on onshoring. Finally, McCary emphasized that reducing downstream healthcare utilization is also a factor that the agency is considering. And to my knowledge, FDA hadn't previously explicitly announced that factor until about a month ago.
Thanks, Monica. So that's really interesting. That's certainly different than what we've heard from FDA in terms of their priorities. We typically thinking about their priorities being safety, effectiveness, and other incentives. And I know we'll get into it, but it's going to have some interesting downstream effects on industry. But we've heard of voucher programs before. So how does the NPV program or the CNPV program differ from those that we're already aware of, the rare pediatric disease designations, the tropical disease voucher programs? What's new here?
Yeah, that's a great question. Chad, unlike some of the programs you mentioned, there's no direct statutory authorization for this new priority voucher program. Other programs you mentioned, there's clear statutory language in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that sets up these programs. Notably, some of the other programs you mentioned, those vouchers are issued after a particular product is approved. For the National Priority Review vouchers, they're issued while FDA is considering the review of a particular application.
One thing that's interesting to me there, you mentioned the lack of a statutory authority for this program. I think this will cut across some of the themes that we'll get into as we continue on these topics. But I think what's interesting there is, on the one hand, a program that is not based on sort of an express statutory authority could go away at any time. And I think we'll touch on that maybe with some of these other programs. But on the other hand, I mean, we've seen recently sunsetting built into the statute for some of these statutorily based programs. And so people have been watching Congress to see, for example, if the rare pediatric disease priority review voucher program will be extended and if that'll get into the next round of omnibus legislation. So it's an interesting balance in terms of people thinking about trying to avail themselves of this program. On the one hand, anything that can be created without statute or by agency discretion can go away in the same manner. But on the other hand, we don't have this built-in drop-dead deadline that some of these other programs have.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And the fact that you point to the rare pediatric program is still sitting in congressional limbo, and that's an established and well-versed programs that most sponsors are aware of. So this more novel program, Monica, I think at the outset, you raised a good point, almost, get it while it's hot. If there's a chance to avail yourself of it while the current commissioner is in charge, there's something there. But you also touched on something else, that FDA is giving this to both approved and unapproved products, as you've sort of seen in their public announcements. So I guess it sort of begs the question, what does this mean? Where can this voucher be applied, or as FDA even said? And by that, I mean, can the voucher be applied in terms of only for the drug that's nominated if it's investigational, or for an approved drug, does it just attach to any application submitted by the company that's awarded, or do we even know at this stage?
That's a great question, Chad. I think with respect to where the voucher can be applied, we're still learning about that. I think the most recent knowledge we have of one of these vouchers actually being used is Novo using a voucher it was granted for a higher dose form of its GLP-1 drug. But it will be interesting to track going forward how different companies use the vouchers they're awarded. Additionally, unlike some of the other voucher programs we've discussed, the National Priority Review voucher cannot be sold as a voucher. As Nate and Chad, both of you know, the other voucher programs, the vouchers themselves can be sold for $100 million at least. These vouchers issued under the National Priority Voucher Program are non-transferable. However, FDA has suggested that they can be acquired through M&A activity. So, for example, if Company A receives a voucher, Company B could get access to that voucher by requiring Company A. So there could be real interesting applications in the sort of greater corporate landscape once companies have these vouchers and we learn how they're used in practice.
Yeah, that's a fascinating insight, because on the priority review vouchers, those typically fetch roughly $100 million of the market, sort of based on what's out there publicly. And so you can almost imagine that if a company gets the CNPV voucher, that there's almost a market value attached to that, and it becomes a sort of an asset in the M&A space. And, as we've seen so much activity over the last couple of years, it could, in theory, fuel that. But of course, it would then have all the associated risks that go along with that.
I think that's a great point, Chad. I mean, one thing, though, when we're thinking about the price that's attached to a priority review voucher, a lot of that value is that the voucher comes and attaches to, is issued after approval of something that FDA wants to incentivize, or Congress wants to incentivize in the case of these statutory programs. And then sponsors can acquire it and then apply it to something where they have a real desire to get to market quickly based on, a lucrative product candidate. Maybe there's an exclusivity race, something like that. And so I wonder, as Monica alluded to, there's still some questions about Is this indication specific? What types of applications can this voucher actually attach to? And I think that that's going to affect how potential acquirers look at it.
And I think there's also the same reliance point because we've been discussing that this program could go away. I think industry in general is comfortable. Let's say if you got a priority review voucher for a pediatric reason, that there was a congressional authorization, there was a statute that regardless of whether the product is authorized, it'd be much more speculative to say buy a company or divest a segment if potentially the benefit, this 1 to 2 month review, could just go away at the drop of the hat or the change of certain agency personnel. And I think that's a key element for industry. But Monica, there's certainly other, I know we've been discussing it, and there's other things that industry is affected by with this, price considerations, manufacturing considerations. Could you walk us through a few of those?
Yeah, I think you hit on a couple of the key ones, Chad. Price is certainly a factor that FDA said they're considering. To me, the voucher incentivizes making an early announcement of what the price of your drug or biologic might be. If you're a manufacturer, we've seen that strategy awarded, I think, with at least one voucher in the first round. And I think similarly with respect to manufacturing, the program really incentivizes making kind of clear statements about where the product will be manufactured. But it'll be interesting there to see whether a program like this has any downstream effects on manufacturing, for example, with respect to drugs, API manufacturing, which is typically done overseas. Going on a similar point, Nate, in terms of that you were mentioning that there are a lot of unknowns with the program, there are a lot of transparency concerns with the program. There's been significant criticism from the Hill and others. Pazder, at the current head of CDER at the time that we're recording, himself has been very critical at the program. So there's certainly tension within the agency. And there has also been reporting that an initial FDA vote for a voucher program actually did not include the review team for the particular product, and that the decision on whether to award the voucher only included votes from senior agency leadership. Finally, I think we'll have to wait and see whether there's litigation generated as a result of this program, certainly in the kind of post-Loper Bright landscape where there's less deference to agencies. Courts may be willing to kind of rein in FDA when it exercises authority under a program like this.
And I think that's an interesting point because you could think of traditional challenges to agency decisions, but here, I think you described some of the groundwork where, in theory, somebody could say that the agency itself isn't aligned on its own decision-making, or that agency decisions were made outside of the folks that make those safety and efficacy determinations. And so I think in that light of the industry factors, there's the balance of risk versus opportunity. And it's maybe not clear where the balance lies right now, but there's certainly a good amount of risk in let's say, relying on leveraging these programs. But do you think that the vouchers or this program, is it a significant change in FDA's review and approval of drugs and biologics, or is it more of the same in a different format?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to wait and see. Either products for which these vouchers are used, the review actually differs significantly than other products that FDA reviews and decides whether or not to approve.
So it's an excellent point with the CNPVs. The foundations are unclear. The policy basis is unclear and maybe not quite carved out at this time. FDA and what we're seeing, and I put this topic on the list because it's just an example of where we're seeing a lot of very rapid fire policy changes, position changes, thinking changes. But just last month, FDA put out an article in the New England Journal of Medicine describing what it referred to as the plausible mechanism pathway. Have you guys heard about this? Do you guys have any thoughts about this? I know I have a few, but it's just one of these very unusual things. And I was curious to get some of your initial thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I know you've really dug in on the plausible mechanism pathway in general, but one thought, I think, just as a macro piece is just this practice of announcing FDA policy shifts and shifts with respect to the review of drug and biologic applications in the New England Journal of Medicine itself is interesting. It's not consistent with what we've seen from the agency in the past. Typically, there are good guidance practices for publishing draft guidance, putting out opportunities for comment. FDA has its own press release function. And so that's been a shift, and I think is notable just from a starting point before we even get into the substance.
Yeah, Chad, could you maybe summarize the article or just kind of share the key takeaways so we can get a little better understanding of what the plausible mechanism pathway is?
Yeah, here you almost have a philosophical discussion in this New England Journal of Medicine article. So it sort of sets the stage. It describes a process of expediting the development, the testing, the review, the approval of certain bespoke or personalized therapies, perhaps obviously focusing on an example in the gene therapy space. So what the agency is doing in this article is they're walking through an example of a child with CPS1 deficiency. And through this sort of development pathway, they pull out what they refer to as 5 tenets of this plausible mechanism pathway. It may make sense to just run through these for illustrative purposes, and we can dig in a little bit more here. Number 1, FDA describes identifying a specific or molecular or cellular abnormality rather than, let's say, a broad set of diagnostic criteria. FDA seems here to be looking for a clear diagnosis based on either a genetic mutation, an underlying condition, something where we can say X causes Y. The second tenet is that the product itself is targeted to those biological alterations, that it's trying to be on target with whatever that mechanism is. So let's say in the case of CPS1, that's a condition that's caused by mutations in the CPS1 gene, leading to insufficient production of CPS1 enzymes. And by targeting that alteration, we have a targeted mechanism of action.
So what I'm hearing is that things that would address, the symptoms of a condition would not fall under the ambit of this plausible pathway. We really need to get to the underlying disease or condition at the source.
Yeah, it seems to be the case. And maybe in that sense, it's not unlike what we've heard from the current FDA leadership with, some members, Dr. Prasad, for example, has raised a number of concerns about drugs that his view don't go far enough to address the underlying condition. This seems to be in line with a preference for truly disease-modifying therapies or targeted towards disease modification. And similarly in this space, if we're still walking through these tenets, the third is that there will be a well-characterized natural history of the disease of the sort we often expect with sort of these rare genetic disorders, patients as their own control in these rare conditions. And then once we sort of have those factors, a sponsor of this product, this is the fourth tenet, could confirm that this target was successfully drugged or edited. That evidence might not even be direct. FDA, in fact, alludes to supportive mouse studies in this example that show certain on-target gene editing. But then down the line, this fifth tenet is that there is an observed improvement in clinical outcomes, whether that's going to be improvements during long observation, periods of remission. Any thoughts on that, Nate?
Yeah, I'm curious, is your read that this means that sort of the clinical improvement needs to manifest quickly or be direct, or is there still room under this plausible mechanism pathway for example, you have some intermediate measure or some surrogate measure that you're going to see manifest more quickly. Is that something that would fall under the ambit of improvements in clinical outcomes, or does that also need to be as direct as the targeting of the drug or biologic?
It's a really good question, Nate. Obviously, it's difficult to read the tea leaves on what I would call a pretty philosophical document, but it does seem FDA is focused more on the target and more on the outcomes. And then, as we sort of get into it, having gone through the tenets, FDA has more or less said that if a manufacturer can show success with what it referred to as consecutive patients, whether it means that literally or something different, a number of patients, if it can show those outcomes, and those seemingly could be delayed. So to your specific question, I think FDA envisions maybe not an immediate outcome, but one that eventually can be sustained.
Yeah, that's an interesting point regarding the several consecutive patients. When I think of a gene therapy or gene editing technology, it always seems to me to be so bespoke to specific patients. So how do you think in practice manufacturers can take this guidance in the form of a journal article and apply it to their drug development?
It's a wonderful question. And I think this is very much in line with what we've already seen in, let's say, the gene therapy, the gene editing space, particularly for rare diseases. I mean, it's not uncommon. You could have, for sufficiently rare condition, you could have clinical trials of single patients. Here, the agency is talking a lot about single expanded access, single patient INDs. And so by consecutive, it may just be referring to a certain volume of individual treatment INDs, but ultimately, it's just a little unclear at this time. But I think it's key that FDA is also trying to put in more hooks in terms of its thinking here, and that a manufacturer that's successful in one program this way may be able to leverage the data from this for another. However, at the same time, it's also on the back end caveated with that any sponsor that's successful in this approach is going to need to demonstrate or at least locate, identify, collect, generate enough real-world data, long-term data. And the question is, how different is that than what we know? I mean, any thoughts on that, guys?
Yeah, I guess I'm interested in you mentioned sponsors, who could be taking advantage of this new pathway. What types of products do you think those sponsors would be seeking to get approved, and what type of data do you think they would need to be generating?
Yeah, it's interesting to look into it because this description, this article is so key to what we think of as genetic medicine, as genetic therapies. In particular, this article is really focused on what would say bespoke therapies and almost describing as individualized and personalized. In the cell therapy space, this makes sense. This is, you could think of autologous therapies, different cell doses, personalized levels. How applicable is that beyond this rather narrow subset of products and even patient populations? The FDA has a line in there talking about childhood effects as almost so that we're almost thinking specifically about rare childhood disorders. But FDA does throw out the potential that, well, we see no reason why this couldn't apply to other areas of drug development over time. It just doesn't really elucidate it on this in what is a very, frankly, short article in EGM. So it leaves a lot of questions as to that. But for now, anyone who is in that space of gene therapy, cell therapy, especially those who are really targeting an underlying mechanism of disease, it might not be necessarily a clear pathway where, let's say we're going to try to file for accelerated approval, but it is certainly a signal that at least folks in FDA are changing their thinking on the quantity of evidence that might be needed to generate an approval. And for those whose products might align with these tenets, with this pathway, as FDA has put it out, it's at least worth asking. It's at least worth thinking about how that's going to change over time, because clearly FDA is thinking about, well, how do we reduce the burdens on data? How do we reduce the burdens to get these drugs into the market? And I think if you're in that space, even if it is uncertain founding, how viable is this NEJM article as opposed to, let's say, the accelerated approval regulations? I don't know that it matters for products sponsors for these types of genetic medicines insofar as, hey, FDA is really trying to accommodate us here, and so let's reach out, let's see where that's useful. For all other persons, for all other types of products, it might be more of a sit, wait, see how this evolves, see when some guidance comes out, maybe a regulation comes out. But in some ways, it's not different than any other product sponsor asking FDA, what do we need here? In that light, maybe it's a positive. I'm curious if you guys have any other thoughts.
Well, it sounds like outside of the limited examples that you highlighted that seem very directly on the nose, whether that's gene editing, cell therapies, and the like, it seems like it's a bit of a wait and see mode. And I'm thinking about this not just from the perspective of a sponsor, but also from the investor community. I mean, it sounds like there's a very direct applicability in these spaces, whether or not the principles behind this particular article could be expanded beyond those, very directly on point use cases is something that we'll need to continue to monitor.
Yeah. And I think ultimately it comes down to whether or not it's a pathway. It is information that informs us how some very senior folks at the agency are thinking about how to approve or otherwise authorize very novel medicines. And so it's something worth paying attention to. But, similar to our discussion on the national priority vouchers, it sort of comes down to these uncertain, soft, announced through a journal article, announced through press releases, very soft policies. So, we thought it might make sense to actually talk about other developments that have a little more traditional rulemaking associated with them.
I think Nate is going to dive into a little bit of an announcement by FDA that took one of the agency's more traditional forms of announcing a new program. And this really touches on the agency's actions with respect to biosimilars and specifically the status of interchangeables. Nate, do you want to discuss the kind of relatively new draft guidance document on this subject?
It's a great question, Monica. It does look a lot more like what we've traditionally seen from FDA, although there are elements of this new approach. And so at the end of October 2025, FDA published an announcement that it was taking steps to facilitate and streamline the development of biosimilar products. And that included, as you alluded to, a draft guidance document that sets out some of the situations in which FDA will not expect to see clinical efficacy studies in developing biosimilar products. And so that all looks very similar to what we've typically seen from the agency. And indeed, given that this went through good guidance practice, was published as a draft guidance, which itself looks very similar to 2015 draft guidance, this is the kind of thing that FDA probably had in the cooker for a long time. we'll get into this, and I'll just say this quickly, but there is another element of this where they've actually announced that they plan to engage in a further initiative with respect to interchangeables. And that looks a bit more like what we've seen in some of the things that you've alluded to, where FDA has come out with an announcement without, the underlying guidance that would put some meat on the bones to the announcement.
So sort of a hybrid between the old way of doing policy and the new way.
I think that's right. I mean, the time will tell, and we'll get into it, what the interchangeable initiative looks like. But at least at this stage, that's right.
For those who may not be familiar with the terms, Nate, can you explain what biosimilars and interchangeables are?
Sure. Yeah. So biological products, which are products comprised of living organisms or developed in living systems, have had a parallel development and FDA review process now going back to about a decade and a half now. And when that program was established, there was a desire to create something similar to the generic drug program for what are called biosimilars. But given the nature of these products, the standard is not the same as a generic drug standard, but rather whether these products are highly similar to their reference product and do not have clinically meaningful differences between the product and their reference product. That's the standard for biosimilarity. Biosimilars, unlike generic drugs, are generally not automatically substituted at pharmacies. So if a doctor gives a prescription for a particular biologic, you're going to get that biologic. If you do the same with a drug, generally you're going to get a generic version of that drug. And that affects costs and pricing, which is really what FDA is focused on here. And we'll get into that in a minute. But there is this heightened standard, this interchangeable standard, which requires that an applicant not only show that the product is biosimilar, that it meets the standard I described for biosimilarity, but also that it can be expected to produce the same clinical result in any given patient as its reference product. Or if it's a biological product that's intended to be administered to multiple individuals, that the risks with respect to safety or efficacy of switching between the reference product and then proposed biosimilar or the proposed interchangeable is not greater than the risk of just not switching at all.
I think that's a great point. And I'm reminded too that it's maybe not just an old form of policy, but it's more consistent across different FDA regimes in the last administration. So I recall in 2024, the agency put out a similar draft guidance document on interchangeables that this recent one was referring to comparative efficacy studies. That one was talking about potentially avoiding switching studies for interchangeables. So it almost seems from that lens that it's a continuation of what the agency has already been doing. But I don't know if it's even just the agency. Does this initiative to streamline and expand the biosimilar interchangeable development, make them more available, is that all aligned with FDA? And do we have other parties? Is Congress looking into this as well? What is your take there?
Within FDA, certainly sort of a long, relatively long, given how long the biosimilar pathway has even been around, relatively long and bipartisan history, really focused on this biosimilar versus interchangeable pathway. And for example, the Biden administration, they criticized this distinction. They said it leads to confusion and misunderstanding about the safety and efficacy of biosimilars. And they put out budget proposals calling for Congress to eliminate the distinction altogether. Commissioner McCary, the current FDA commissioner, has said that he thinks that all biosimilars should be interchangeable. And so there's really been a long-standing desire within FDA to collapse this distinction between biosimilars and interchangeables. Congress has not acted on that to date. And so I think that although this guidance document is not really specifically targeted to the interchangeable and biosimilar distinction, I think there's a desire within FDA to expand the availability and the development of biosimilars, and then also to get more of them on the market in a way that they're interchangeable. And that really speaks to this point that I alluded to about price.
Yeah, so it sounds like in some ways similar to the voucher program and possibly the plausible mechanism pathway. This is yet another example of FDA taking all its authority under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and trying to implement policy changes in that way rather than going to Congress.
I think that, in the announcement, the FDA commissioner said that they encourage Congress to act, but in the meantime, we're not wasting time, which I think really sums it up.
You can almost look at it in some ways as a cleanup policy, because when the BPCIA came into effect and when these products became licensable in the United States, there's no background, there's no history for biosimilars and for interchangeable products. FDA still hasn't approved many. And when these programs came into force, FDA put out guidance documents, in the late 2010s about, say, switching studies, comparative efficacy studies, having never approved these. And they even acknowledged that, look, we didn't know how this worked back when we made these guidance documents, and now we do.
Yeah, I think now we do is a key point, but I think it goes a little bit further than you said. Not only from FDA's perspective, they've highlighted in this recent announcement that they think there's a lack of authorized biosimilars, but they actually pointed to, and this is not something that you typically see FDA talk about, but in the announcement, the percentage of approved biologics that have biosimilars in development. And so they're actually expressly looking at incentives to actually develop biosimilars and develop interchangeables. And I do want to quickly put a finer point on this pricing question because I think it looms over all of this discussion and all of FDA's focus. I mean, during the announcement, Commissioner McCary was very direct that this was related to pricing. Secretary Kennedy said that this was intended to be responsive to an executive order from President Trump to lower drug prices. And it really goes back to this pharmacy substitution point that I mentioned. Biosimilars are, for all intents and purposes, when we think about them as FDA regulatory lawyers, generic versions of biologics. But because physicians typically will prescribe a brand name and without that automatic substitution, they'll get that branded product. There hasn't been the same downward pressure on prices that this current administration and indeed the Biden administration has indicated that they want to see. And so I think that the desire to facilitate the development of more interchangeables is really intended to address that. And although we haven't seen concrete details on what this to be named interchangeable initiative will be, it's pretty clear that we should expect it to be something in line with what we're seeing with biosimilars, right? In the biosimilar context in this guidance, FDA is cutting down on the situations in which you need to conduct efficacy studies. And what the administration has alluded to with respect to interchangeables is cutting down on these switching studies.
And almost to ask you for more editorial point, do you think FDA is sort of adopting that language of pricing? Because, of course, we don't think drug prices in and of themselves as part of FDA's responsibilities, but is it just competition by another name? I'm thinking about generic small molecule drugs. To increase competition has often been sort of FDA's goals. You have the competitive generic therapy designations for existing small molecules. And so in other words, is FDA kind of going off script here, or is this just the same thing by a different name?
I think that it's a bit of both. Certainly, we've seen prior FDA commissioners, prior administrations talk about expanding access. They use language like access, competition, but they're really getting at the same point, which is that expanding the supply and market participants for a particular drug or biologic will drive down prices. What I think is different here is the thing that I pointed to about the development of the products. It seems like this announcement very expressly is looking earlier on in the development program and less about FDA's role approving or not approving products and facilitating competition, but really even the data requirements at all and whether that will facilitate investment in developing biosimilars or interchangeables.
Yeah, and maybe that's a great point to end on and link all these three programs together because FDA and the commissioner have really been clear that the agency is focused on getting more products to patients at more affordable prices. And I think they've taken three somewhat different approaches, but all with a similar goal in mind. So it will be interesting to see how these three programs evolve and what else the agency comes up with in 2026 and beyond.
Yeah, I agree. I think these programs, they're going to evolve or drop off, but there's going to be a lot to pay attention to. So, from that perspective, it's exciting. And, here we're just talking about a few recent policies, but there's so much more to look at going forward. So I guess brace for 2026, everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
Monica, Nate, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for the discussion. It's a great point and great way to end it.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks, Chad.
And a big thank you to our listeners for checking out this episode in our Connected with Latham podcast. You can subscribe and listen to new and archive episodes of Latham's podcast on LW.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you can listen to podcasts. If you have questions or like additional information, please email us using the links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time. Thank you.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins, LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.